Hello, Biosci 101. This is Dr. Georgie, and this is your last lecture for the semester for spring 2021. So confocal microscopy plus the kitchen sink. And I'm sorry, I think this is lecture for 15. Sorry about the number on there. Okay, so confocal. Think about two fluorescent spots in your specimen. The light is going to radiate out in all directions from those spots, right? So those spots were the original red spots, and you're going to excite the fluorophore that's in that location in your specimen, which happens to be a tube just for this example. And once you excite the light, you got the whole Jablonski diagram reaction happening. Remember that? Anyway, you're going to emit light of a different color, and that light is going to radiate out in all directions. It doesn't make a beeline for the objective, unfortunately. That's not how light works. So you're only going to collect the light based on the NA of your objective, right? You're going to try to collect the most light possible. So you're only going to collect the light that does make it to your objective. However, what's happening is that light is going in all directions from every spot. And what happens with wide field fluorescence is you're going to collect some out of focus light too. So you maybe want to see the top spot, but you're going to also get light from the bottom spot, because if you broadly illuminated your sample, you're triggering multiple fluorophores, including ones that are out of focus. And then you're also collecting the light from the ones that are out of focus. And so let's say you were trying to see the top spot, but you're going to also get some info from everything else that's out of focus that you've managed to excite and has undergone fluorescence. So how do we deal with this? We do something called optical sectioning. So we basically try to excite things only in a thin plane of focus, and we also try to collect the light from only that thin plane of focus. And then we step down, because the stage is motorized and can do nanometer level steps, like 2 nanometers, 3 nanometers, that kind of tiny little steps. And so we go down to the next plane of focus, and then we take another image, and then we take, keep stepping down. And this is the kind of result you can get. I got this from Holly Aaron over at Berkeley. She runs the imaging core there. This is a sort of extreme scenario. So this is an embryo, and the nuclei are stained with a fluorescent dye, so that you're seeing the DNA basically of this embryo that has several hundred cells. And you're seeing an embryo on the left that is taken with wide field microscopy. I got to say, they did a really bad job. You can get a better image even using wide field, but it's sort of showing you this general concept that you just get a giant blur, because this embryo is three-dimensional, right? And there's signal coming from not just two spots, but lots of spots, hundreds of spots. Each of these nuclei we're going to consider a spot. And when you're doing this in wide field, it's really hard to get things in focus, because there's always out of focus signal that is impeding you being able to just see, one small plane. And so the point of a confocal is that you do it one plane at a time, one plane of focus at a time, very thin plane of focus. And then you just step down through the entire specimen, and then you create a 3D rendering, volume rendering of what you looked at, which is what you're looking at over there on the right, where it says confocal. And obviously, this is a much better way to image your specimen in this particular case. Sometimes wide field is just fine. It depends on what you're doing. And confocals tend to be the one that everybody wants to use, because they're $500,000 and they've got the best objectives, and you just figure like your project's important, and of course you want to use the most expensive tool there is. But in truth, it's important to think about what your question is and which imaging modality can best answer your question. Sometimes it is confocal, very often it is, but not always. So how does a confocal microscope take optical sections? It uses a combination, it uses lasers to illuminate just a tiny portion of the specimen, because lasers are, you know, small and precise, and also already colored, so that's lovely. You don't need an excitation filter with them. That's sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. It just depends on your specimen, to be honest, because you're going to get a dimmer signal, right? You're only giving it one color, not a whole range of colors. It also uses a pinhole to reject the out of focus light. And what you get in the end is called a Z-stack. So it's a series of images that are located on top of each other. Basically, as you went through your specimen, you've created this stack of images. And software can then recreate the 3D image for you. You might hear people talking about 4D, that's a Z-stack, which is 3D over time, the fourth dimension. There's marketing will use things like 6D, which is just like different colors in 4D or different locations or whatever. The confocal has the best optical lenses in the objectives. They are literally selected at the factories in Japan and Germany, like hand selected out as, you know, like let's put the best class in the confocal objectives. And then everything is motorized. You really operate the whole thing from the computer. Every single component is motorized. The only thing you ever do physically is put the slide on there, and then the motorization basically takes over. And I like to say that it's sort of similar to an MRI in the sense that an MRI does optical sectioning, except MRIs don't use lasers. They use magnets and other sources of signal. But just like you can go into an MRI and they can get optical sections of your head images, but you're fine. So similarly, you put a specimen on a confocal and it's fine. Like you're not literally cutting into it. That would be a histo and a microtome, right? You're cutting into it using physics tricks to look inside of it, basically. And it can be, obviously it can be thicker than something you would be able to see with wide field, but it can't be as thick as, like, say, an entire finger. So we're talking, like 100, 200 microns thick. A cell itself is about 10 microns thick. This image, this embryo is probably 200 microns thick, this entire embryo. So confocal, oh, here's some more examples. The top is wide field and the bottom is confocal. And let's focus on the pollen at the end. So seen in bright field, you're gonna just see that it's red, fluorescence, etc. With a confocal, you're able to actually look inside this little grain of pollen and see that there's different fluorophores inside as opposed to the outside of it. In fact, here's a Z-stack. So what you'll do when you're imaging is you'll go through the pollen. You can see you're starting on one side and getting the spikes, and then you're going inside. This is an overlay of two different colors. And so you go through the center where, you know, you see all of the, whatever is green in the center of this pollen, this particular pollen, and then you come out the other side, see the little spikes again. And then you do this 3D render that you've got over here on the left of it. And these are just some other 3D renders. Okay, so a confocal is actually called laser scanning confocal microscope. Everybody just calls it confocal for short, but its full name actually, or it's, you know, that's how to say its professional name. This is like the name you put in a paper, you know. You say, I used an LCSM, not a, you know, but in real life, you just say, I used a confocal. Okay, so its name, its formal name, does tell us a lot about what it is. It's a really good name. So LCSM, laser scanning confocal microscope. Laser is the light source. that you use for fluorescence. So confocals are fluorescent, about fluorescence. They're a fluorescence tool. And you're only illuminating, again, just a single point. Scanning. Well, how are you going to see your whole specimen if you only look at one point? You're not. You've got to move that point. And so you do it in what's called a raster scan pattern that I'll show you on the next slide. So this is interesting. It's a huge difference in operating the scope because you've got to think about it in terms of you're doing a point scan, literally a point at a time. You're not just opening a shutter and going, let me see what's there. Let me illuminate the whole specimen. Let me get all of the signal. That's wide field microscopy. With confocal, it's going to take longer because you're pointing the laser to just one part of your specimen and then to the next and the next and next and next until you're carefully getting everything from the one plane of focus, and then you're going to step down to the next plane of focus. So as you can guess, the confocal takes longer, and there's all sorts of great things that come out of the fact that you're illuminating only that one spot. Of course, notably the fact that you're illuminating out of focus light, but there's also issues with bleaching and so on and things like that. And you know, how bright is the signal? Bright enough? Is it's dimmer in general? So the confocal part of its name refers to these little pinholes that are in the light path. That was the invention, the genius of a confocal that managed to eliminate out of focus light. I'll show you a drawing of that in a moment. But first, the raster scan. So raster scan is just something that occurs in a lot of situations. I think TVs, I'm not sure if they still do this, but TVs use a raster scan. So this arrow is just showing you the path that your laser will take, and you will scan a point, you know, in the beginning and then along that line, and then the laser is returned. There's mirrors in there that are moving really quickly to make this happen. It's returned to the next beginning of the next line, and you can see this as you're watching. Your image will appear in lines. It will sort of scroll down. You'll have the top of your image, and then it'll just sort of unveil itself on the screen as you're watching. And so you're collecting data usually just from the one direction, although it's a whole thing about whether you want to get the return also. And this is just for one image, for one plane of focus, for one color. Then you might scan again for the next color and then step down the motor and then get the next Z slice and the next one and the next one. You might end up with 30 to 100 Z slices. It just depends on what you're up to. In the old days, this would literally take me 6 hours to get an image on. I was using Biorad MRC 600, so it was like the second confocal ever made, the second model. Now, now we're talking, to get the same image, we're talking minutes, maybe, not even. I mean, new confocals are so fast. They're brighter, they're better in all sorts of ways. They've got solid state lasers. I used to have to turn on different computers and use different operating systems just to see the image. Nowadays, you just see it as it's being collected, it's immediate. And all of this happened, this sort of big leap in technology happened because of fluorescent proteins driving the need for confocals, so that it wasn't just you know, a select group of several hundred very patient grad students who were willing to spend 6 hours watching the focus knob, in my case, on my scope to get one image, you know, and go through 2 operating systems in 30 minutes once I finish the scanning to collect to visualize the image. You know, it takes a certain mindset to be willing to do that. Whereas now confocals are used even, even by my optometrist who has a medical version of it to scan my retina, you know, presses a button, everything's automatic. So to go from a specialty instrument to something widely used all over the place took a lot of innovation. And it really happened thanks to fluorescent proteins driving the need for confocals. Confocals, in truth, are better at fixed specimens, but they can also be used with modifications for live specimens, by the way. So note that from a confocal, you're getting just a blinking spot of emitted light with the location attached to it. So there's nothing that you can see in the oculars. You can't see your confocal image in the oculars. So all confocals also have a regular wide field fluorescent scope basically built in with a separate, with an arc lamp and a CCD camera and so on. That should say confocals. It's interesting because it kept autocorrect somehow doesn't think there can be plural confocals. Okay, so you're just getting this blinking spot of light. There's nothing to see, like your brain can't decode that. Even if the scope would let you see that in the oculars, you're just gonna see a blinking spot of light, which will not have meaning to you. The software has to reconstruct it. The scopes also won't let you see it because their early confocals are big issues with the lasers bouncing around the room and possibly blinding people. So there's a lot of safety built in around having a very powerful laser that you're using and directing to just one spot, one part of the specimen. You can absolutely fry tissues. Sometimes we do that on purpose. I've seen things bubble up and like I've seen stuff get cooked literally on a confocal if you look at stuff too long. Remember, lasers are also used in surgery and things like that, right? So there's all these trade-offs between the laser power and the fact that you want to be gentle with your specimens, especially if live. So if we're not going to use a CCD or CMOS camera to just, open and collect the image all at once. On a confocal, we use something called a PMT. Often there's several PMTs actually, one for each signal or things like that, just to speed it up. And a PMT is something that is generally used in all sorts of engineering situations. And what it does really well is take a dim point signal and amplify it and make it brighter. So your signal is hitting the PMT, and then PMT is reading out basically a brighter version of your signal, and the software knows where the laser was at in that, in that moment that data was collected. And so it reconstructs a digital image for you of, intensity and on, this location on your digital image, there's this much signal and then that much signal and that much. And as you know, that is basically an image, and that's just one image of the Z stack. All right, so wide field fluorescence is what usually you would be currently doing at this point. Hopefully in 102, you'll get to do some on campus with our scopes. And that includes light from many planes of focus. And it's best if your sample is dim and thin. So dim and thin, wide field. There's a lot of newer systems that have come along with this wave of improvements in microscopy and in fluorescence microscopy that are just phenomenal, actually. So this is my little mini quiz. Which of these two specimens calls for a confocal? The big fat, I call that a dino bird. I don't know what it is, but it's an entire animal of some sort, but small. Because if you look next to it is just one cell. Okay, so that's just 10 microns, not even, so this little mini animal or just the thin cell, which one calls for a confocal? Obviously, the one with more three-dimensionality to it, okay? If it's just a cell, that's thin enough for a wide field, although in truth, if you're trying to see different parts of the cell from, like what's on top, what's in the bottom of the cell, you might need a confocal for that too. And I promised I would tell you how the out of focus light gets eliminated. And so let's look at this diagram and let's see if I can get the pointer to, nope, pointer's not gonna work today. Okay, so look down, there's a cell as a specimen, and they're showing you three focal planes through that cell. And we just got done talking about resolution and how bad axial resolution is. The truth is, in a typical cell, you can only take about 10 sections or so, depending on the external resolution of your scope. A lot of people overdo what's called oversampling. They just take lots and lots because it feels better. So you can take more than 3 focal planes through one cell, but not all that much more. Anyway, so pick one of these 3 focal planes, actually put the one on the bottom and follow the red arrows on this diagram. And ignore everything until you get to that black line at the top that is called the detector pinhole aperture. And you see how those 2 red lines come to focus there and they go through. So that is the focal plane that you are collecting. You're collecting the bottom focal plane in this example. And the light rays of the light emitted by the fluorophore in that focal plane at that point are going to make it through that pinhole that you put just in the right place. It's confocal. It's in the same focal plane as the focal plane you're trying to collect. Those other 2 focal planes are out of focus light that you want to reject. And the way that they've drawn them on here, so don't worry about the excitation light rays on this diagram that are in green. But if you can kind of follow it, you see that there's another red crisscross that has the name out of focus light rays. So they come to focal point, they come to focus at a different plane, not where the aperture is. And by the time they come to the tiny, tiny pinhole aperture, that has to be just actually 1 airy disk for it has to match the size of the airy disk of your objective. So by the time those out of focus light rays from the other focal planes hit the pinhole, they're going to be blocked. They're not going to make it through the pinhole. Whereas the light rays that are in that one single focal plane that you're trying to collect will make it through. That's the genius. It's literally a tiny hole. We used to like swing different holes in front. Now they have an aperture that is controllable and you can just dial in the size, but it's literally that. It's just a hole, a pinhole in the right place, the same as the old pinhole cameras and so on. It's just knowing your physics really and figuring out the design of this that made confocals possible. And the design has been around since like the 1940s, I think. People started coming up with this idea, but it was really in the 80s that we had commercial systems that were actually, viable. The kind I was describing was considered a fantastic confocal. We were excited to work on it, fighting for time. It's still the story. Pretty much if there's a confocal, usually people are fighting for time on it because it's just beautiful and it's very satisfying to use. And it's very easy to get lost in it because you can zoom in, you can look around, you can capture different things. You just see so much. It's a very fun, exciting scope to work on. And they only just get better and better. Here's a little simulator online. Confocals, like I said, were kind of realistically used in labs in the 80s and since 1980s, 1990s, and so on. And then in the 90s and the early 2000s, there were, thanks to actually, there were a lot of innovations then. And then basically, there's been a constant stream of innovations for the last several decades. Every year, there's more and more imaging techniques, more and more scopes. It's pretty exciting times right now for fluorescence microscopy and microscopy in general. So soon after confocals existed, people came up with something they called a deconvolution scope. But actually, although people will sell you a decon scope, I don't think they do anymore, actually, at this point. In truth, what decon is software. So it's a regular wide field scope. It was cheaper than a confocal, basically. It was a wide field scope that had a good stage and used math in the software to get rid of the airy disks, the blur that comes from airy disk, basically. So it's getting rid of the out of focus light by knowing the shape and size of the area disk on your particular scope because you took an image of a bead or something, a fluorescent bead. And then it just, it sort of returns the out of focus light back to the point source. And it's still wonderful software that you can and should do when you're processing a confocal image. You can sharpen it up, basically. You can do image processing on your Z-Stack. That is deconvolution if you have access to it or know how to use ImageJ to get some. There's a variety of ways that you can do it in ImageJ. So you're basically sharpening up your image, and you actually get a lot of real information by doing that. So that's deconvolution. Soon after that, multi-photon or two-photon scopes were made real because the actual patent on them, I think, is, again, in the 1930s or something. A female scientist like worked out the physics of this, but making them happen in real life took a while. So multi-photons scopes use interesting physics to illuminate the specimen, and they basically use a really long red laser, so a long wavelength of 900 or more, and it's high intensity, and what you're doing is creating a situation where there's a single spot in space where the photons are going to, simply put, sort of run into each other. And because of the physics, when two photons interact in the same exact space, instead of 900 nanometer light, you'll get half of that. You'll get 450 nanometer light. And the advantage to that is that the so you are shining this red light, this red laser through your specimen. It will travel further into your specimen, and also it's very gentle to the specimen itself. It's a lot gentler than the higher energy, for instance, UV lasers that we use in confocal and so on. So this was a way to get a little bit deeper in, to penetrate, get the light to penetrate more than 100 or 200 microns in, but even like multi-photon sort of says we can go even down to 300 microns in, or, you know, something like that. And it's gentler. They're pretty finicky. The lasers super finicky. They're also expensive, but they are around, and you can encounter two photon. There's a lot of them, a lot of people using them, especially if they're doing live imaging. But these days, oh, and here's the illumination pattern. You've seen this before, I think. The illumination pattern of wide field. So you're kind of illuminating a lot of stuff, and then you're getting, there's an emission PSF, but remember you're getting the PSFs from all of those, you know, everything you've illuminated, not just one little spot. So with this confocal, you're actually, you can bleach a little bit around it, but you're really, the laser's focused on one spot, and you're only collecting the light from that spot. So you're illuminating less, and you're more importantly using the pinhole to block out any out of focus light. And the multi-photon is really the champion of not bleaching your specimen, because you're gonna only illuminate, you know, that one tiny area where stuff, you know, where the physics is happening and the photons are combining. You are shining a red laser. They never draw that. You're shining a red laser through the rest of it, but because it's so gentle, it's kind of okay. Okay, so these days, the hot scope is a super resolution scope. And that is really where everyone's energy is. There was a challenge sort of thrown down that, you know, physics says basically about 250 nanometers is the resolution limit, given that light, you know, has a wavelength of, let's say, 500-ish. So it's that equation that we were just talking about in the past lecture about the resolving power of a scope, you know, given the color of light that you might be using and so on. And the NA of, you know, the possible highest NA that you could have is 1.5, and the lowest light you could be using might be 400. Sometimes we're using UV, which is, a little less than that, but generally 200 to 250 nanometers. As I've said, I'll say something in that range because again, it depends on your scopes. Let's just say theoretically you could get 200 nanometers, but really you'd be lucky to get 300 nanometer resolution in best case circumstances. So let's call it 250. So super resolution, so there were people, not biologists, to be honest, physics people who were telling us, oh, you could do better than that. And we were like, yeah, right. Well, they were right. Physics was right, as usual. And we've achieved 25 nanometer resolution using light. So not electrons. Electrons, yeah, sure, they got 5 nanometer resolution, no problem. That's because they're electrons, right? Electron microscopy. But using regular old light, we have managed to get super resolution. That's beyond the resolution limit of light. And not just a little beyond it, not just like actual 200 nanometer. So we would have been happy with that. That would have been amazing. But I mean, 10 times better. 25 nanometer resolution. Oh, holy moly. That's telling proteins apart in a cell. I mean, never mind cells for me telling cells apart. It's telling, literally being able to see one protein next to another in a cell. And so it's opened up a whole new world of information. These scopes also are big data, like they generate an insane amount of data, and the images are gigantic in terms of the size and processing that and so on. And the most famous of the super resolution techniques is light sheet microscopy. It uses a sheet of light, counterintuitive, but it works. And nowadays it actually uses a patterned sheet of light. So a lot of these techniques involve what's called structured illumination, where you shine a pattern over your specimen instead of just a beam of light. There's also super resolution techniques that come from how you prepare the specimen and getting parts of it to shine at different times. So there's a lot of different super resolution techniques. There's literally hundreds just under the SPIM, or the title of SPIM, if you look it up, which is sort of a type of light sheet. And it's because everybody is sort of creating their own and trying to stamp, they're like, oh, I can do it better. But they're all basically, except for the few that are very important and useful, that are about specimen prep, they're a little harder to use, honestly, though. Light sheet microscopy is where everybody's kind of going. And Eric Betzig was the main guy who won the 2014 Nobel Prize on this. And he actually has an interesting career path because he was not in science for a while. He was working in his dad's, what was it, like car rental agency or something. And he literally, this sounds like too stereotypical, but it's true. Like he literally built a light sheet in his living room on the side because he had this idea. He was in science and he had this idea and he left. He couldn't get funding and things didn't work out. And then he left and he was still doing this with some friends. And then he made it work. And then he immediately got embraced pretty quickly, became a big shot, and everybody wants the scope. I still remember the first time I heard him talk, we were all dazzled. Like, it was extraordinary. This guy was showing us reality as we had imagined it. Like, we're looking at the confocal images and they're pretty good, but they could be better. And suddenly this guy shows up at conferences with these extraordinary images and is talking physics. And we're like, oh my God. So he quickly got a big lab and a Nobel Prize for the innovation, and was wooed by Berkeley to come out. And it was kind of a big coup for them. He's actually in two places. He's at Genelia Farms, which is the headquarters of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which actually funds a ton of science research and sort of, the creme de la creme, top-notch science research. And so they have this sort of spaceship building in a place called Genelia Farms outside of Washington, D.C., where they're very like, there's no limits on science. Let's see what we can do. And imaging and microscopy is one of their main things. And they do have amazing one-of-a-kind scopes there. And Eric Betzig is kind of the king of that place. And then he's also king over at Berkeley. He came there, interesting little side note, because so Holly managed to somehow introduce, I think at an AIM conference, Eric to his current wife, who was a graduate student at Berkeley at the time. And because she wanted to live in Berkeley, they accepted a position in Berkeley, and she's an amazing microscopist. Her name is Naji. Eric's cooking up right now this incredible microscope. So I've been telling you this whole time, like there's different microscopy techniques, not one scope solves them all, has it all. Don't just use a confocal just because it's the best. There's a place and time for wide field. There's a place and time for DIC. There's all these different scopes and different techniques. You can't just have one scope. And Eric is totally acknowledged, and he said, but now I'm going to make it so you can have one scope. And he's trying to put 14 different techniques on one scope. And so, which he calls a Swiss Army knife scope. Anyway, so light sheet microscopy, rapidly evolving field, really rapidly evolving. Come back to the AIM conference every year to hear about it and to see different people innovating in light sheet and in general in the field of super resolution. It's a really exciting time for microscopy. All right. And now, last but not least, what I call the kitchen sink, random little snippets that might have not made it into your lectures this semester. And so I'm just telling you now before you leave, so, while I still have you. By the way, the little greenish bluish border is cells I took. It's just a repeated pattern from, let's see if I can use a pointer. No, anyway, microtubules, fluorescently stained. Okay, so here's a picture of cheek cells under DIC. They look just like what you saw in the Meiji, right? No, I hope not, because you shouldn't see this on the Meijis. You had to stain them to be able to see them, right, with methylene blue. The nice thing about DIC, and you can do this when you get back to campus, we have a bunch of scopes with DIC on them. Nice thing about DIC is it's a contrast generating technique. And you don't even have to stain them. You just put them under the scope, and it uses physics, and it gives you this beautiful image. But notice, so there's 5 cheek cells here. Notice how, especially in the ones on the right and the 2 on the right, it looks like the nucleus is really fat, right? Like, is there sort of a fried egg situation here where the nucleus is just popping out of the cell and the cell is super thin? You see that a lot when under DIC. You see what looks like a really nice 3D image, and it's deceptive. So interpreting DIC, it's important to know that no, just because something looks fatter and thicker doesn't mean it is. It might be, or it might not be. You just don't know, and you have zero way of knowing through DIC. The only way you can know is to also put the sample on a confocal or something like that. So here's a side view of these cells. It looks like the nucleus is kind of bursting out and taller than the rest of the cell, but the reality is the cell surrounds that nucleus, and the nucleus is not fatter than the rest of the cell. Why does it look like that? Well, because basically, what it's telling you is that thing that looks fatter is either fatter or it has a different refractive index. A DIC image is a map of refractive indices of your sample. And so if something is denser, it will look fatter. So the truth that we know because of other techniques is that the nucleus is denser. And so in DIC, it looks like it pops out a lot of the times. So don't be fooled by DIC images. Just because something looks thicker doesn't mean it's thicker. It might just be denser. And we have no way of telling just from the DIC index, the DIC image. It could be a different refractive index, or it could be thicker. It's going to look the same in DIC. Okay, arc lamps, moving on. I just want to make sure we haven't talked a lot about the illumination source for fluorescence microscopy. And just a quick note that there's, we use arc lamps because they're super bright, and usually they're xenon or mercury. And you got to start with super bright light because you're going to throw away most of it, right? And so they're way more intense than just a bright field scope, and they're way more delicate. They require turning on and leaving on for half an hour and turning off and leaving off for half an hour. They can explode and create toxic mercury gas that would lead you to evacuate the whole building, explode at the end of their lives, or if they're just unhappy. Fortunately, they infrequently explode, but they're not very into being carted around and, you know, shaken up and so on. They're delicate little things that require a lot of TLC, basically. And you have to make sure you know how old the bulb is and how many hours. And there's a whole, you know, obviously the scope reps are telling you 200 hours, and most people are pushing them to 1,000 hours, but then, you know, you're kind of cutting it close. They get dimmer as they get older and so on. Nowadays, if you went to buy a new scope, you'll probably get offered an LED illumination source because they're a lot less finicky. They last forever, and they've gotten bright enough. It took them a while to get LEDs bright enough, but it is possible now. And they're actually a little bit more environmentally friendly than arc lamps. But here's arc lamps. Also, we tend to think of the arc lamp as just giving us white light, but in truth, they have their own spectrum and their own pattern too, and they're better at certain colors than others. And so this explains a lot. If you go from one scope to another, you're like, it's brighter on this one, but I have the same filter set. How come it's brighter? Well, maybe your arc lamp is different. It's called an arc lamp because there's an arc of gas that sparks the color. So you send electricity through gas and get color out, basically get light from that. So yeah, there's actually a spectra to know about your arc lamp, in fact. And if you're doing anything quantitative, it becomes really important. If you're just doing qualitative, like, oh, let me see what there is to see. Is there a signal? Yes, no, then you're okay. And this is just showing you, you know, also your eyes are pretty good at greens and yellows and things like that. They're really not good at blues. We're actually pretty good with reds too. We don't pick up on the blue. The blue is going to look really dim to us, even though it's actually quite bright, both in the arc lamp, which you're not looking at obviously, but this is just a reference, but also when you're looking at the fluorescence itself, like to see, is the lamp on, you know, do I see anything? Is it coming through? Or you're looking at your specimen, just know that about your own eyes. And then this is just showing you different arc lamps, just to show you, look, arc lamps are different. There's a bunch of them, etc. Okay, so moving on, totally another random thing is just be careful. I don't think I've seen you guys do this yet, but just so you know, there's something called the aspect ratio in an image, which is just how long by how tall, height versus length. And you don't want to change it. So your image, the real image is always a rectangle because that's the shape of the CCD chip in your CCD camera. So you're always going to end up with a rectangle. Now, can you crop it? Sure, but don't take the original image and stretch it in a weird direction because you've just changed the information in a big way. You're making the cells a shape that they aren't, for instance, in this example. Or here's another example. I've cropped this so it's not a rectangle anymore, just made a square around that cell. And you can make it bigger, smaller, whatever, but you're keeping the same aspect ratio. In this case, it's kind of a square. And if I turn this into a rectangle, I've just given this roundish cell, round triangle, whatever you want to call it, a totally different shape. I made it long and lean, and it's not. So just be careful with images. What this means is you always, making it bigger or smaller, you drag from the corner, never from a side. So don't pull a side down or make a side longer or shorter. All right. You should know what calibration means on a scope. So if people say, is the scope calibrated, or we've got to calibrate the scope, that just means setting up the scale bar in the software. Sounds so fancy, but it's really simple. And really, it's done once when setting up the scope, but for whatever reason, software forgets or resets or downloads, upgrades, downgrades, whatever. Somehow I seem to have to calibrate scopes more often than I would think. And to do it, you use a slide with a grid of a known size called a micrometer, or a ruler or anything. You just put something under there that you know the size of, and you take a picture of it, and then you tell the software from here to here, for this objective, for each objective is this many nanometers or micrometers, depending on the objective. And you put it in the software, and then the software knows, okay, you're using the 10x, well then it's, you know, your cell is this big or your specimen is this big. It can draw a scale bar on your image. You really want to present data with scale bars on them. You don't always want to have a scale bar on your image because sometimes you're gonna crop it or move it or do something different. And the software often burns the scale bar into the image. And then you're sort of like, oh, there, I have to use it. So it's easier to like have your final image go back into the software and be like, put a scale bar on it now. This is really relevant when you've got motorized scopes, because they know what objective you used to take that image. And so it's really easy to get a scale bar out of your image, because it reads the software reads the metadata and goes, okay, here, you know, where would you like your scale bar? Which, by the way, there's only really one place to ever put it, which is in the bottom right of the image. But your software, for reasons unknown, lets you put it anyway. Anyway, what else? Bulbs. So aligning bulbs is another thing you might come across. I just want to make sure if you're like in an internship and they're like, let's align the bulbs, you know that it's a thing. So this is the arc lamp bulbs. They, for whatever reasons, I guess they're hot and they tend to wander around. Or, you know, if you knock the scope accidentally, or the table shakes or whatever, the bulbs in the arc lamps, and all bulbs, but usually it's the arc lamps, the bulbs can get out of alignment. And there's a way to align them that you just basically use knobs or hit the button for the self-aligning ones, which are awesome. But often older scopes have knobs when you're like up, down, left, right, basically, and you can look this up on YouTube or whatever, but you're aligning there's a filament. So all those, we think of the light is coming out this beam of light, but actually it's a filament. There's always a filament. And you would see it as a filament, except there's something called a diffuser in front, which is a piece of glass that is rough. And it's exactly like people use in bathroom windows and so on. So you kind of, the light comes through, but you can't see the shape of the light. And that's the idea, is the diffuser gets rid of the image of the filament and turns it into this just general glow in the shape of a beam of light. So when you're aligning a lamp, you actually take the diffuser out so you can see the filament, and you're looking behind the filament. There's always a mirror, so it takes the light that goes in the wrong direction and sends it back towards your specimen. And you're just making sure the filament and the real reflection line up. And then you've aligned your bulb. If a bulb is out of alignment, you'll get all sorts of weird things on your image. Like you won't be able to get an evenly illuminated image. This is technically part of coloring, but again, it depends on the scope. Transmitted light, just regular bright field scopes, the bulb is not going to go out of alignment. There's nowhere for it to go in the design, but arc lamps have a lot of room to wander around, and they do. Okay, so another thing, background subtracting or flat field. So let's say you do have an uneven illumination, you just can't get rid of it for whatever reasons. Or you have schmutz. Schmutz is basically anything on your slide or your specimen that you don't want. It's a Yiddish word for, let's just nicely say, dirt. And it's like that little fiber from your clothing that landed in with your specimen, or generic junk, you don't know what it is, but you can tell it's not your specimen, but it's always in the right where you want to image. It just, Schmutz has a way of finding, you know, finding a place in your image. And you're not allowed to Photoshop out Schmutz ever. You are allowed to crop your image so you don't see it if the Schmutz has been kind enough to land in an area that is not that exciting. Okay, so also dirt in your in various parts of the microscope. So anywhere in the microscope can show up as out of focus sort of blobby stuff if there's a giant chunk of dirt somewhere. So, and giant, of course, in a microscope is not that big, right? So a bunch of dust maybe somewhere. So what happens? Like, what can you do in these situations? They are less and less common as objectives get better and scope design gets better and so on, but it's still good to know how to do this. And you might be saying, well, what does the objective have to do with this? Well, the objective is round, right? It's a bunch of round lenses. Well, some round lenses and some, anyway, a series of lenses, but the image you get is not so perfect at the edges. And now there's a lot of things, elements they put in there to compensate, but you sort of don't, we still don't trust the edges of an image just out of maybe habit. And think of looking through a door keyhole, and you know how things get distorted, they're bigger in the center and they're further away in the edges. Actually, that's happening in your objectives, and depending on how good they are, there's corrections that are taking that into account. But you might have a scope that is not corrected for that. What are you going to do? You're going to do a background subtraction. So what you do is you take an image of nothing. So you either defocus or go to an empty area. That image of nothing will have your Schmutz, will have your uneven illumination in it, but it won't have your specimen. And then use the software, the image acquisition software you're using. Somewhere in there, there will always be a B-sub, a background subtraction, or flat field. Background subtraction is what I see it called most often. And you are mathematically going to subtract this background image out of your images in that session. And that's legit. You're allowed to do that. And it cleans up your images beautifully. Suddenly they're evenly illuminated. Suddenly that out of focus schmutz is gone, you know, that you can't get rid of because it's not in your specimen, it's somewhere in the scope. The way the software is set up, sometimes it should automatically reset when you turn it off or whatever, but it doesn't always. So sometimes what happens if somebody's been doing this and you'll get a ghost it is sort of showing up in your image, like there's a giant hole in your image and it's constant no matter what you do. That's probably, you got to get rid of the background subtract. Chroma, one of the Chroma and Omega are the two companies that make scope filters. And so Chroma gives out these plastic slides that are wonderful. They're just in different colors, and they're just plastic that fluoresces in a certain color, and they're used to flat field. So you can take an image of them, you know that your specimen is completely flat and even, and you can see if your scope is actually distorting things, basically. And when you're back on campus, look for them or ask for one. We've got them all over the place. So ask to use one. All right. Last and certainly not least, always read your objective. There's so much good info on your objective. It's the heart of your scope. We love our objectives, we respect them, we treat them well, we clean them, we don't ever scratch them, and we read them because there's tons of info. And even if you just have to sort of stick your phone and take a picture of it one time to read it or unscrew it a little bit, anytime you get on a no scope that you don't know, make sure that you check out the objectives and read them. There's a ton of info. So this is a really great little diagram. I like it because it also cuts into the objective and shows you different objectives have different amounts of glass in them. This is an extreme case, to be honest. A lot of objectives have a lot of empty space, but they all have multiple lenses. So they never have just that front lens that you are cleaning and seeing and making sure the glue holds it in place and all of that, and making sure not to scratch. There's also a series of of lenses inside your objective that are doing all kinds of important things for you. And the writing on the objective itself will tell you what's going on inside. So some of the things it can tell you, and that you'll see recurrently coming up, is plan means it is a flat field objective, so it's corrected somewhat. Apochromat means it's corrected for color aberrations, chromatic aberrations that also happen because light travels through the glass at different speeds, and so you can get the red and the blue totally separated in your image, looking like they're nowhere near each other, but they are, and so on. FL usually means fluor, which is the best lenses for fluorescence, because there can be some internal fluorescence sometimes in some of the glass, so they're just super great for fluorescence. So like this one says, I'll read it. It says Olympus, the manufacturer, LM, like microscopy, plan, apo. So it's plan, it's flat. Most objectives these days are, but some old ones aren't. And it's apo, which is apochromatic. 250x, that doesn't sound right. There's no such thing. That should be two. I always forget to look this up, but it looks like a 25x, and then 0.9 NA after that. And then we're going to ignore infinity. Infinity optics just means it's an infinity corrected scope, which has the optics that allows you to put a lot of elements in between the objective and the camera. And almost all scopes these days are infinity corrected, so not a big issue anymore. Just on some really old ones, you're not going to find them infinity corrected. The color code, the stripe is, the objectives all have the same color stripe for the same mag. And the thread at the top is interesting because different brands on purpose thread your objectives differently, so you can't swap out objectives between scopes. They say this is because some good reason, but in truth, it's entirely because they want to sell you more objectives. And if they're going to sell you the scope housing, they make their money on the objectives. They want you to use and buy their objectives. So it's kind of a pain sometimes, and it leads to brand loyalty, very much so, because people are like, if I just stick with the same brand, usually Zeiss, and then Leica has a lot of brand. Actually, different labs have different brand loyalty, but Zeiss, Leica, Olympus, and Nikon, right, are the four main manufacturers for these high-end scopes. If you buy, your first scope is a Zeiss, you're going to buy your next scope as a Zeiss, because you can take that beautiful high NA 63x perfect objective that cost you $10,000 and use it on different scopes because it has the right threading. If you have different brands, you can't do that. And also that way you only deal with one repair person. Because we're a teaching facility, have all brands, which is just really unusual. And yeah, that's it for objectives. They always include the mag and the NA, and the NA is what you really care about, and you really always want to know about your objective when you're imaging. I think that's it. That is it for this semester. Well done, everyone who's listening to this. You've made it. So good job.